In order to make choices that are best for you, please note that this episode does contain brief mentions of rape.
Welcome to Lit Vibes Only, where we lit the shit out of books we love and hate. I am Kelsey.
And I am Amanda. And this is our second Lit It or Quit It episode for the month of February. But I want to first share. Did you say get it?
Let's get it. This is going to be a weird episode, you guys.
Kelsey's feeling a little punchy today because she had a very long day of work and we are recording this after work. So, you know, it's going to be one of those. Yeah. It's going to be one of those episodes. But before we get too off the rails, our socials are, we are on Instagram at litvibesonly_podcast. And we are also on YouTube and on TikTok at Lit Vibes Only podcast. So
you almost got tripped up.
I know. I feel like honestly I get a little nervous doing the intro.
It's just also it's so late and I'm so tired. So
it's
I
such
really
an
have
easy
to think
to screw up. But if you are not already following us on our socials, please take a moment and do that now. And come join us over in that world. We have so much fun. And also, I always forget to say this, but Kelsey is so good about reminding everyone, if you haven't yet rated and reviewed us on either Apple Podcast or here on Spotify. I don't know why I said here on Spotify. You might be listening to this on Apple Podcast. On either platform. If you haven't yet, please take a moment and do so. It really takes like 2 seconds, but it does so much for us. It really, truly does. I feel like we say this so much on the podcast and people are probably just tuning it out at this point, but it really does. It really helps.
Please,
if you could just write a little blurb.
That's if you love listening to our podcast and want to hear more, the only way we're going to be able to continue this is if other people hear this podcast. So tell your friends, tell your family,
tell your coworkers, tell your neighbors.
Get everybody on the podcast and rating it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we have fun, and it's so much more fun when there are more folks in the mix.
Yeah,
and,
we want
giving us
you
feedback.
to have fun.
Yeah. So, Kelsey was just sharing something with me. Concerning that she had come across on Book Talk, and I didn't get to hear the full story. So please catch me up.
Okay, so there has been a recent trend on TikTok where, I would say Book Talk, where these readers are talking about wanting to leave politics out of reading. And they're putting up these posts about like, why are people all of a sudden putting politics into reading? Like, can't we just leave the politics out of reading? And so people are like responding with political videos because I mean, I'm curious to hear your take on this because this is the first time you're hearing this before I get into it.
I think I need some clarification. Like, what do they mean by books suddenly being political? Because I feel like books have always been political to some degree. And are they talking about it in the sense of like banning books? Are they talking about it in terms of like the content of books themselves being political? Like, I need some.
I think that people were maybe talking on Book Talk around like political issues and books. And then people who mainly read for entertainment were like, why are we bringing in politics? So I think that's where it landed or started.
So folks were like inserting political things into conversations about books.
Yes, I think so. That's how it started.
Okay. And what are people saying? Like, I don't see are folks just like all of our conversations about books should be only because the thing is books talk about social issues. They talk about political issues. They dive into things like race and culture and identity. So I'm
Amanda's just confused.
I'm a little befuddled over here. Yeah. Like, I don't get it.
So I think I saw, people just complaining about like not wanting to talk about politics when they're reading books.
Okay.
But really, that kind of means either you're really not reading anything that like, and you'd have to be like reading very fluffy stuff to not encounter any social issues or any political issues,
Mm-hmm.
or even issues that are framed in a different way. Like in fantasy, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's oftentimes like this underlying rebellion happening against the government, and the government is doing really shady things or killing people or something like that. Like that is political, right?
Yeah.
But maybe people are just not really seeing the connections between real
Yeah.
life in
Yeah.
those stories. I'm
Yeah.
curious,
Yeah.
but yeah, like it's inevitably political, and
Yeah.
you can't get away from it really. I
I,
guess like I don't
yeah.
know.
I can understand the sentiment of considering everything that's going on in our world, wanting a space where you can kind of decompress from all of that and just escape. Like, I understand the escapist element of reading for sure. But
Mhm.
I think to assume that you can always fully prevent social and political issues from becoming part of the conversation seems really naive and
Mhm.
unrealistic. Like at some point, those things are going to be coming into the conversation. You don't have to talk about it all the time, but
Mhm.
it definitely has a place in these conversations. And
Mhm.
to get upset when that happens is surprising to me.
To say the least. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's just a conversation that's happening on Book Talk right now.
Interesting. Okay. Well, thanks for the update.
Yeah.
It's gotten me thinking now about some of our previous episodes. And yeah,
Mhm.
even when we're talking about like romances or like fantasy and romantasy, like
Mhm.
we're still talking about issues that those books bring up and that they touch on. And so, yeah, that's surprising to me
Yeah,
and unfortunate because I think that's also a
exactly.
really great thing about reading. It gets us to like,
Mhm.
yeah, reflect, question, and consider what's happening around us versus just like blindly going along. So,
Yeah. And I think that I do identify mostly as like I read for entertainment kind of
sure.
reader,
Yeah. Hmm.
but all of my books, sure, they can be entertainment. It's like
Yeah.
today we're talking about Kindred, right? And
Hmm.
that was like
Hmm.
a super heavy
Yeah.
topic and
Hmm.
book, which
Hmm.
I typically don't read, but in my books, there are still themes of these
Yeah.
issues, right?
Yeah.
And they're easy to point out too. So it's
Yeah.
not something, I don't know, I enjoy it in that way
Yeah.
because I also still am thinking about these important issues, but in an entertainment way.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know.
I don't think it has to be like an either or. I definitely think it
Mm-mm.
can be like a both and. And I think it's just a more expansive way of interacting with text and also just like viewing the world instead of like looking at
Mm-hmm.
everything as like an either or, like this dichotomy. Like if it's this, it
Yeah.
can't be that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I think people just have a tendency to want to put things into these compartments, silos, etc. But yeah, to your point, the book we're going to be discussing today is definitely those the folks on that you were listening to on Book Talk might not be particularly happy with our conversation today because
It's all, yeah, social
it's
issues,
pretty social and
politics.
political. So yeah, I guess we can just get started. So this is our second, like I said, our second Lit It or Quit It episode for February. And I'm gonna start off by telling folks
Mm-hmm.
why I had Kelsey read this book. So I had
Yes.
Kelsey read Kindred by Octavia Butler for several reasons. One, as we've said earlier in this month, it is Black History Month. And so both Kelsey and
Mm-hmm.
I were really conscious of picking books that were by Black authors. And Octavia Butler is a phenomenal and very well known, highly regarded Black female author whose
But
work
was a local.
continues. Is she from Seattle?
Yeah. Or at least
Or from
the
like
end
the.
of her life
Uh-huh.
was in this area. Yeah.
Oh, I actually didn't know that. Thank
Yeah.
you for that very
Someone
cool
told me
tidbit.
today, actually.
Oh, yeah, I did not
Yeah, it
realize
was
she ever
wild.
was like in this neck of the
It
woods.
was in like Lake Forest Park. And I was like,
Oh,
what?
whoa.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, even though she has passed on, like her works are still incredibly popular. And
Yeah.
so I wanted Kelsey to have a chance to read this particular author because I don't. Have you read any of her other books? Have you read
I
like
haven't
okay.
yet.
Okay, so
I
great. So that
have
was
them though. I have them
yes.
because the parable, like all of those books sounded really great. And
Yeah.
I'm so curious about it.
Yeah, I'll be curious to hear what you think about the parable of the sower. But so that was the
Hmm.
reason number one is that I wanted Kelsey to have a chance to like interact with this particular author. Two, even though it is historical fiction,
Hmm.
it does have like this sci-fi element to it. And I know Kelsey isn't necessarily a sci-fi person, but I
Hmm.
thought again presenting historical fiction in a way that was like slightly outside of the norm might be more intriguing for her versus like a more standard historical fiction
Mm-hmm.
text, especially because this book is technically a past and present book. Granted, the present in this book is the 1970s because of when this book was written, but
Mm-hmm.
it is switching between the past and present. So again, it was like, okay, Kelsey's not going to be stuck in the past for the entirety of this book. Um, so I also like kept
Argue
that in
that.
mind. And then I just wanted to get Kelsey's perspective and feedback on this book. We already read a book that dealt with enslaved peoples with horse, and that did not go well. Kelsey did not enjoy that.
I
And
did
so I was
not.
curious to get her feedback on
Uh,
another story, another narrative that had to do with slavery in it, and to see how she
mhm.
responded. And lastly, this book was recently made, fairly recently made into a series on Hulu, which I also watched and
Oh,
enjoyed. And so I thought it would be cool for Kelsey if she did enjoy this book for her to also be able to go and check out the series as well. So those were my reasons.
well, thank you. All of those many reasons. Ah.
So yeah, Kelsey, why don't you summarize it and then I'll find out if this was a lit it or quit it for you.
Okay. So let's see if I can get through this. The main character is named Dana. Dana is from the 1970s and it's 1976. She is married to a white man in 1976. And all of a sudden, she starts feeling like dizzy and confused. And she ends up waking up in a time period that is not her own. She does not know this exactly right away, but she wakes up and is in this place where this little boy is drowning, and the mother is there trying to help him. And she helps resuscitate him and saves him from the water. And then she kind of notices, these people talk different. And this man comes up to her and scares her. And she ends up popping back into her timeline. And so, again, at this time, she doesn't know that she's going to a different time, but that was the first instance that this happened. And this continues to happen in her timeline. It's like over a span of like a couple days or hours. It's a really short timeline compared to what she ends up living in the timeline in the past. And so she ends up being transported like, I don't remember the exact amount of times, but like maybe 5 or 6 times. And she's kind of transplanted at different time periods of that little boy's life. And every time she gets transported, something is wrong with the little boy who ends up growing up. His name is Rufus. She calls him Roof throughout the book. And she realizes along the way that this is one of her ancestors and that it was him and then this other woman, Alice, who she meets when she's really young as well, like Rufus, and realizes that these two are going to be her ancestors and that these ancestors are from the early 1800s. I think the first time that she realizes what year it is and asks Rufus what year it is, it's 1815.
Mm-hmm.
And so Rufus lives on a plantation. He is a white boy, and his father is the plantation owner. And I can't remember his name, not necessarily important, but he's, supposed to be called master or sir anytime that Dana interacts with him. And so basically, the story is about her like going back and forth in time and essentially kind of acclimating to the life back in the 1800s. At one point, her husband does go with her back in time, and he ends up getting stuck for 5 years and has to live there for 5 years because the only person that's being transported back and forth is Dana. And at the time that she transported back, he wasn't near her and wasn't touching her. And so basically, she gets to know like the family that owns the plantation, who are also her ancestors, but then also the enslaved folks who are having to work at the plantation, whether that's in the fields or that's in the house. She goes through quite a bit of like challenges throughout her time there. And the time frames that she ends up staying there vary. It can be like at one point, I think she's there for as long as 8 months, and another time she's there for like hours. So it just depends on the time that she ends up time traveling. So both Rufus and Alice, her ancestors, grow up, and she essentially is part of their lives throughout their history together. And so she just learns like what happens to her ancestors back in time. At some point, Dana realizes that when she is either scared for her life or is just really scared, she ends up going back to her time. And so there's a time where someone is beating her, that she goes back to her life. And there's a time where she's being whipped by the main plantation owner. There's another time where she actually slits her own wrists in order to like go back to her time. And then the final time that she goes back to her time, she is with Rufus, and he ends up grabbing her, but she's already moving back in time, and he ends up not going with her, and neither does part of her arm. And so she ends up in the hospital, and that is actually the very beginning of the book, and the very end of the book explaining what happened to her arm. So it ends with Rufus dying, and she knows how he died / she was his murderer.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I would say one quick thing just to clarify too. So yes, Dana can leave the past or leaves the past whenever, as you said, she's feeling threatened, her life is in danger. But the other thing to know is that Dana is only called back into the past whenever Rufus is in danger. So the very first time that Kelsey was telling you at the beginning of the story, when he's drowning in that river, that he was very young. And that's the first time Dana is called back. And then I think the next time he like accidentally set his curtains, or he purposely set his curtains on fire because he was mad at his dad. And so he's about to, potentially burn the house down and die. And so he's afraid, and Dana's called back. So that's kind of how the time traveling works in this book, when she gets called back and when she's able to go back into the present. So just wanted to point that out too for folks. And then at the very end of the book too, the reason why she is able to go back into the present is because once again her life is in danger, because trigger warning, Rufus is trying to rape her, and so she ends up in the process killing him and is able to go back. But yeah, her arm is left behind. Okay, so as you can probably already tell, this book is pretty heavy, pretty deep, has some pretty intense content in it. But before we get into all of that, Kelsey, and we have not discussed this at all, so I have no idea.
We have not.
I'm so nervous. Was this book a lit it or a quit it for you? My palms are literally sweaty over here.
I definitely have like some criticisms of the book, but I would say it's a soft lit it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. Now I can like rest easy for the rest.
Yeah, I know. I didn't even tell you anything about like what
I had no idea, y'all. Okay. Okay. So then let's start with, because I know you're going to have criticisms, as you said, but as always, let's start with perhaps some general things that you did like about this book.
So I did like the time traveling aspect and the fact that it was to her ancestors. It wasn't just to like a random place in time with random people. It was actually to her ancestors, which I thought was really cool. Like, I wish I knew more about my ancestors and like wish I had experiences or at least got to see them or know them. So I thought that aspect was really cool. What else did I like? The parts I did like, I guess, was the storytelling of the lives of the people. The whole point of the book really is to show you the way slavery was embedded in people's psyches in that time. So you would think that someone from the 1970s would have would really fight it and not fall in line essentially with what is going on with slavery in the time. But it is actually very easy for Dana to just kind of acclimate herself. And consistently, she gets like kind of put back in her place by these white plantation owners or white people in general. And so this fear is really embedded in her throughout her time in the 1800s with her ancestors. So I thought that was powerful. But yeah, I think those are the things that I enjoyed or appreciated about it.
Yeah, I actually, one of the things you said really resonated with me when you were like, yeah, it would be so cool to have the opportunity to go back and know my ancestors. And I think, especially, we talked about this very briefly, I think, with Horse. especially with enslaved peoples, like there were very few records kept.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, because my ancestors weren't allowed to read or write, there also like aren't a lot of written narratives or
Mm-hmm.
journals or anything. And so I think especially for African Americans in this country, having that opportunity to go back and like know your people and know your roots is such a luxury and doesn't exist for most of us past a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
that for me, especially when reading this book, was, yeah, I would just say it really resonated with me and made me think a lot about how much of my history and my ancestry I'll just never know. You know, there are like white people who can
Mm-hmm.
trace their lineage back to like
I
the Mayflower, you know, and I'm
know.
like,
Or
I
further.
or even further, you know,
Yeah.
like medieval Europe or whatever. And I'm like, I will
Mm-hmm.
never be able to do that. And most people
Mm-mm.
who have my heritage and ancestry will never be able to do that. And what a loss to not have that. And so I remember thinking about that a lot when I was reading this text. So I'm glad you pointed that out. And then the part that you mentioned about her acclimating,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and they bring that up in the book too. But I do wonder, I don't know if wonder is the right word, because you did kind of touch on it when you were talking, which is she does try to resist, right? She, especially at the beginning, like she
Mm-hmm.
does try to put up a fight and leave and kind of
Mm-hmm.
tell folks that she doesn't belong and speak up for herself. But when an entire system is both set up to be in opposition to you and also has the means, all of the means to keep you
Mm-hmm.
in line, at some point, fighting is futile. And especially as a woman on her own in that time period,
Mm.
after so many beatings, after so many whippings, after so much manhandling, you know, there's like, what else
Yeah.
can you do aside from just like put your head down and hope to make it to the next day? And I think sometimes it's easy for us in the present to be like, oh, well, like, why didn't they make this choice? Or like, why didn't people try harder? And it's like,
Sure.
that's a luxury that we have, you know,
Yeah.
to look back on a situation we can never fathom. I've
Mm-hmm.
thought about it too. Obviously, you want to put yourself in the shoes of the main character. Like, what would I do in this
Mm-hmm.
situation, right? If I'm coming from 2024 and it's like,
Mm-hmm.
damn, I would just want to survive right to the next day and maybe see if I
Mm-hmm.
could find a way to escape, etc. But yeah. Okay. Well, I know you have things that you didn't like about the book.
Well, I was curious
Yeah. Yeah.
about, I don't know if you read anything about this, but I didn't get a chance to yet.
Hmm.
But how much of this was like was like a history of somebody's, and how much is it all just
Oh,
like made up? I'm
so how much of it
curious.
was like biographical from like her family, you mean?
Well, I don't know. Was it her family or was it like,
I personally
um,
haven't done a lot of like reading about the writing of this book. So that I
mm-hmm,
don't know. I remember when I first read it and I have the book behind me,
mm,
there are notes, like author's notes afterwards, but I haven't looked at them in a while. I do know that she did a
yeah,
considerable amount of research. And we didn't say this earlier in this episode, but this
mm-hmm.
particular plantation in the book was set in Maryland, just to give folks a sense
Oh,
of,
yeah.
of time and place. And I know that she did a fair amount of research. I do want to say, and again, folks don't quote me on this, but when I read the author's notes a while ago, it was based on an actual plantation and an actual that was actually in Maryland. So
Mm-hmm,
she did very much ground it in reality and like actual
mm-hmm.
history, and it wasn't completely contrived in that sense.
Yeah.
Obviously, you know, slavery was a very real thing, but she did
Mm-hmm.
base a lot of it, I think, in actual like historical accounts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was curious about that.
Yeah.
Because there's so much detail about these people's
Hmm.
lives
Hmm.
in the novel. And
Yeah.
so I was curious, like, oh, did, like at the end where Alice actually hangs herself, was that something that was true? Could we
Yeah.
know? Like, I
Yeah.
don't
Well,
know.
also too, just because that's another thing too, like one of the things that you never really hear about is how common or how often enslaved peoples did take their own lives.
Mm,
And to think about like the horrific existence that many of them lived, it would seem
yeah.
like an option, perhaps what's the word I'm looking for? Just a better option perhaps than getting up the next day and going through what they were going through. And I think there's a
Mm-hmm.
quote in the book. What is it? Oh, there's worse things than being dead.
Oh, uh-huh.
And it's not something you really ever hear people talking about. I've never really encountered it that
Mm-hmm.
much in the books that I've read about this time period. And it does make me wonder, because I know during like the Middle Passage, when people were being shipped across the ocean, that some folks would jump overboard when they had the opportunity to, rather
Yeah.
than, get shipped all the way to the United States or to the Caribbean. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a whole nother part of slavery that we don't talk about a lot, know a lot about.
Yeah, totally.
I think, well, I guess one question I have for you is like, how
Mm-hmm.
did the so this book, along with The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, which I've mentioned,
Okay.
I think
Yeah.
I've mentioned it already this month in one of the other episodes.
Mm-hmm.
But both of these books, I think, really stood out to me when I read them because, like I said, they don't shy away from the horrors of slavery and the beatings
Mm-hmm.
and the whippings and the raping. Like it's constant.
Mm-hmm.
Like whether it's Alice,
Yeah.
whether it's Dana, whether it's other enslaved individuals, families being torn apart and folks being sold. And I
Mm-hmm.
just wonder how that landed for you as you were reading it. What was your response to that?
Sometimes when I read these kind of books, I definitely disassociate a little more than when I'm reading a fantasy book, right? Because they are so heavy. And so I guess that was my response to this
Okay.
content. But yeah, it's horrifying, right? Actually, initially I was like, God, Dana has it like pretty easy. Is like was kind of my thought for a
Mm-hmm.
while. And she did essentially, but then at some point she gets taken out to the field because Rufus is mad at her, right? And then she like passes out because she couldn't take the constant whippings and the constant push to do more. And so I appreciated that that was in the book too, where there were different jobs that people were doing, and like
Mm-hmm.
some were way worse off
Mm-hmm.
than others. And
Yeah.
then thinking about, so when Alice grows up, right, Rufus is like in love with her or
Mm-hmm.
has this infatuation or obsession with her and ends up like raping her.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when Dana comes back into his timeline or their
Mm-hmm.
timeline. And then the husband, which it wasn't legal for
Mm-hmm.
blacks to get married back
Mm-hmm.
then, Alice was married to this guy, Isaac. And then Dana allows them to leave and tells Rufus to lie about what happened so that Isaac and Alice can get away. But in the end, like they don't get away. And
Mm-hmm.
then what happens to those two is
Mm-hmm.
just is heartbreaking. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like they talk about how Isaac had his ears cut off.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, yeah, like our history is so fucking violent. And I find it weird, like when people, this isn't everybody, but like some people talk about how, oh, that's in the past, that's in the
Mm-hmm.
past, right? And
Mm-hmm.
these people just felt it was okay to brutalize another
Mm-hmm.
human being because of
Mm-hmm.
their skin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And things like that are still in our psyche,
Mm-hmm.
where there are racist folks
Mm-hmm.
who would do awful things to
Mm-hmm.
people of color just because of their skin, or
Mm-hmm.
make racist jokes, or make racist comments to people, or want more for themselves and think that they should have more, and rather
Mm-hmm.
than people of color, like that's still in our psyche. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that not to face that because it's so violent is just
Yeah.
ignorance. We
Mm-hmm.
have to face it, because
Yeah.
if we don't, like, then we're not going to understand like why our psyche is the way it is, right?
Right.
And so it was awful, like reading
Yeah.
about those things,
Yeah.
but also it was the reality for a lot of people. And I
Mm-hmm.
didn't have really a critical lens over Dana, but I know that some of the reviews I'm going to read for 1-star reviews, like they
Mm-hmm.
did, but like I just don't think I could ever if I really put myself in that
Mm-hmm.
situation, I'd be like
Mm-hmm.
scared to death. Like,
Of course.
what the fuck would I do? I'm
Of
not going to
course.
like,
Yeah.
you know? And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. I definitely, yes, absolutely. I think it's so easy again to sit in our cushy little armchairs and judge like
mhm.
these people and the choices they're making. But I
Yeah.
wanted to go back quickly to what you were saying about the lingering, lasting impact that these historical events still have on us to this present day. And I was reading a
Hmm.
little bit about the book prior to the episode. And, at the very end of the book, Dana loses her arm. There is a part of her that
Hmm.
is forever physically changed by her experience in enslaved times in slavery.
Hmm.
And that was a very deliberate choice made by Octavia Butler because she
Hmm.
wanted people to see that, in this case, it's the 1970s, the mid 1970s. Now it's
Hmm.
2024, but that those scars and that brutalization and that
Hmm.
violence didn't just disappear. Like there are lingering what is the word I'm looking for? Like the lingering aftermath of all of those things is still present in our
Totally.
society and our politics and the
Mm-hmm.
psyche, like you were saying, and the collective consciousness of people of color whose ancestors experienced those things. Like it didn't
Mm-hmm.
just disappear. It wasn't just like we snapped our fingers and it's over. Okay, it's done. It's in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's one reason why people want to revise history or want to sanitize it or forget about it, because if we face up to what happened then we also have to turn a critical lens on what's happening right now and how a lot of those
Absolutely.
things are still being perpetuated in different ways, right? But we're
Mm-hmm.
still kind of seeing those patterns of behavior and thought. And so I like that Octavia made it really clear, like, just because this happened in the past, just because it was, a couple
Mm-hmm.
centuries ago, just because it was a couple decades ago, doesn't mean it's like one and done. And what happened to all of those individuals, both the people who were perpetrating the violence and the people who were on the receiving end, like
Mm-hmm.
both parties have lasting, I don't know why I keep on blanking on the word that I want to use, like lasting after effects,
Impacts.
right? Impacts, consequences
Mm-hmm.
on what happened. And I really like that she made that clear.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense. I mean, that as a choice, as a
Mm-hmm.
literary choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also like that she didn't shy away from the fact that so many of the people in the Black community, in the African American community today, have mixed ancestry because of slave
Oh,
owners
yeah.
impregnating the enslaved
Mm-hmm.
women on their plantations and on their property. Like
Yeah.
that happened like on my mom's side, like on her father's side, my
Mm,
grandfather's side, like we know
yeah.
exactly who it was, right? We know exactly
Mm-hmm.
which sister was raped and like that whole like
Mm,
it's crazy. And
yeah.
people are like, oh my gosh, like how horrible. I'm like, this is again, first of all, wasn't that long ago. Let's be clear about that. It wasn't that long
Mm-hmm.
ago.
Right.
And again, I'm just so thankful that she, along with folks like Colson Whitehead, even like Toni Morrison, like they don't shy away from
Mm-hmm.
the harsh realities of what actually was going on during this time period.
Yeah.
And I just like, yeah, it made me like this book all the more. Even though it made it harder to read, it also,
Mm-hmm.
I very much respected her choices and feel like it's what makes it such an important text for people to read.
Yeah. The thing I did not like
Mm-hmm.
about the interactions with Rufus and Dana
Mm-hmm.
is just, I mean, and also it can be,
Like
what is the word?
explained away,
Thank you. It
rationalized.
can be rationalized for Dana's experience. But yeah, she realized she was going back to Rufus, right? Every
Mm-hmm.
time.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe she felt like some sort of connection with him. But time and time again,
Mm-hmm.
he kept showing her that he
Mm-hmm.
was a man of his time and a product of his upbringing, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the political system and social system that was in place at the time. But she does not want to believe it, right? She wants to
Mm-hmm.
believe that he's doing some good and maybe she's made a
Mm-hmm.
difference for him.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it was the third time that she went when he had raped Alice. Like
Mm-hmm.
she's giving like kind of all these excuses for him. And I didn't like that aspect
Yeah.
where she was very sympathetic to him.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really like that. And so, and
Yeah.
she still takes care of him and all of these things. And
Mm-hmm.
some of the things it's like, she's forced to, right?
Sure.
Because of the father and because of Rufus, and also because she is kind of tied to that place because of him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like just getting, she asked him to send letters for her. Back in that time, she can't go to the post office and mail it
Right.
herself.
Right.
One, she doesn't have money, but two, like as a Black woman, she wasn't able to do those things. And so
Mm-hmm.
she had to rely on him in some ways. But even down to like, she calls him Roof.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see that in some of the reviews too. But like,
Mm-hmm.
why was she feeling
Mm-hmm.
so close to this man
Yeah.
who was violent against
Yeah.
her and against the
Yeah.
people that she cared about?
Yeah.
So,
I agree in that. I remember the first time I read this book that I was so frustrated with her
yeah.
multiple times. I was like, why are you still giving him chance after chance? Why are you
Mm-hmm.
still so convinced like that there's good in him and that he's going to make the right choice even after he's continued to
Mm-hmm.
like prove you wrong time and time
Mm-hmm.
again. And I think perhaps now that I've had a longer time to like reflect on this book and think about it, and I'm also older now than when I first read it, I think part of it is at that point, I think at that point, she has realized that Rufus is her ancestor. And I think there's also some
Mm-hmm.
part of us that like when it comes to our
Sure.
relations, regardless of who they are, right? Whether it's our immediate family, a cousin, whatever, we
Mm-hmm.
want to see the good in them. We want to believe that they're
Sure.
good. We're connected to them in this very deep way, and that they're our blood relatives. And so I think there's part of that. Like she kind of needs him to be redeemable, I think, for
Mm-hmm.
herself.
Yeah.
So I think
Until
there's a
he is
part of
just
it.
absolutely not.
Yeah, exactly. And I think
Mm-hmm.
also historically, Black women have been forced to carry so much
Mm-hmm.
and to be the burden bearers, both within our communities and outside of them. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think we see that happening with Dana, where throughout this book, she is bearing the brunt of so much. She is constantly looking out for everyone else, constantly caring for others. And that is a common narrative for Black women up until today, right? Up until the present. And so while it's incredibly frustrating to see, it also, I think, rings really true for a lot of women and for Black women who are reading this text. So I think that also, while frustrating, it's like, no, like that is quite believable, unfortunately, and is a big part of how we were
Mm-hmm.
conditioned and are still conditioned. So yes, it's frustrating, but I don't know if Octavia Butler had written her differently, while it would have been like I think really
Mm-hmm.
rewarding as a reader, I think it makes the statement that Octavia Butler was trying to make, is what I'm trying to say. I think it
Yeah.
was a very deliberate choice. And it wasn't just like, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about it.
Yeah, no, I'm sure it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
And I'd be curious to hear like interviews or see any
Mm-hmm.
sort of her thoughts around that
Yeah.
particular point. The other thing I didn't really understand,
Mm-hmm.
or I didn't like her husband, Kevin.
Oh,
Like there was nothing,
Kevin.
like he seemed like a device, rather
Yeah.
than an actual like important character. Like
Yeah.
he just seemed
Mm-hmm.
like I don't believe their connection because
Mm-hmm.
they're it's never like shown at all. And
Mm-hmm.
then when he ends up going back in time, he kind of
Mm-hmm.
acclimates just fine to this time
Mm-hmm.
period.
Mm-hmm.
And there's weird, I don't remember any of the quotes, but there's like weird things he says to her that are a little like, what are you saying? Or like,
Mm-hmm.
are you? Yeah, it was just, I was curious about that. And then he ends up
Yeah.
there for 5 years.
Yeah.
And then he did become kind of the savior for her
Yeah. I mean, he has
in
to
a
use his
way.
white privilege or can use his white
Mm-hmm.
privilege to give her like a bit of protection and freedom when he's present with her.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I agree to a certain degree. I think it was again a very deliberate choice that Octavia Butler made her husband in 1976 a white man. And then we also
Sure. Yeah.
see this interracial, I don't want to call it a relationship because it wasn't a relationship, but this interracial interaction between Alice, who also, I don't think we've said
Uh-huh.
this earlier, but Alice Greenwood and her mother at the beginning of the story, they are free Black women.
Mm-hmm.
And then ultimately, Alice essentially becomes enslaved on the Wayland, which is
Mm-hmm.
Rufus's last name, Wayland Plantation. So I just wanted to clarify that as well. But so I think she very deliberately wanted to give the reader this kind of parallel. Okay, like here's this like interracial situation happening in the 1800s. Here's this interracial marriage happening in the 1970s. What is
Mm-hmm.
different and what is the same? Can these two people, kind of a white and a Black person, have a successful, healthy relationship? What impacts does our very racist past and present have on a couple, in the present, quote unquote?
Yeah.
So I do think it is a device, I think, to a certain degree.
Mm-hmm.
And also I think she wanted to set up that, I don't even comparison contrast. I don't know if that's entirely what I'm trying to
Sure.
say,
Mm-hmm.
and to get us
Mm-hmm.
to reflect on that, like, okay, given our history and all of the things that have
Mm-hmm.
happened to us, how do we navigate this, or how would an interracial couple navigate this? And especially in the 1970s, which is not that long after the civil rights movement and not
Yeah.
that
Right.
long after interracial marriages were legalized in like what
Mm-hmm.
1968 or 1967,
I
right?
don't even know the year, but
So
yeah.
I think especially at the time that this book was published,
Mm-hmm.
that would have been even more front of mind for
Yeah.
readers too.
Yeah, that's fair. And also, was this the first book that Octavia Butler
Oh, I don't know her
wrote?
publishing history. I don't
Okay.
think so. I don't think
It
so.
was one of the earlier
But it's
ones,
one of the earlier
though.
ones for sure. And
Yeah.
I'm also gonna look. So you can keep talking. I'm just like, let me look and see.
I want to look.
Where this, I have, for those of you who are not watching this on like YouTube, I have the book in front of me. So this book was
Oh,
published. It was published in 1979. And then the version I have here was republished in 2003, but it doesn't have the list.
1979 it was?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When
So
was the
again,
parable?
the Parable of the Sower, I also have
1993.
that behind. Oh, did you look it up? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, I was just
Um,
curious.
yeah. I think, books are a reflection of or on their time and their place. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
writing in this book in the aftermath, or I don't say aftermath because that makes it sound like it's a bad thing, but after the civil rights
Yeah.
movement, right? And just like the shifting
Ugh.
political and social landscape at that time, I think it would have been even more impactful at that time.
Mm-hmm. There was something else I was going to say about all of that. Oh yeah, Alice's story, really,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
Alice ends up being her ancestor, and she like goes in knowing this. She's like, "Oh, that's Alice, and that's Rufus." But this is how
Mm-hmm.
they ended up getting together. Was this forceful way of Rufus was infatuated or obsessed with her
Mm-hmm.
and wanted her for himself, and
Mm-hmm.
so he essentially uses Dana to get
Mm-hmm.
Alice into his bed
Mm-hmm.
willingly, but essentially Alice is forced into this relationship with him, has
Mm-hmm.
several children, only two survive, I think, right? And then at the
Mm-hmm.
point where he's trying to control Alice and her moves,
Mm-hmm.
Alice tries to leave and escape with her final child or
Mm-hmm.
children,
Mm-hmm.
and is caught
Mm-hmm.
and beaten and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then he pretends to sell the children because
Mm-hmm.
he's like angry with her
Mm-hmm.
and wants to, control her or continue to control her, and has
Mm-hmm.
realized that he can't because she wanted to leave still. And that's where he sends the children to his mom's or cousins or
His
something,
aunts, I think. His aunts.
Philadelphia
Yeah.
or
Mm-hmm.
something.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but Alice doesn't know this. She thinks her children were enslaved. And so that's when she hangs herself and kills
Mm-hmm.
herself. And
Mm-hmm.
so that was the story and the wrap up with
Mm-hmm.
Alice.
I mean, like I said, this book is essentially just kind of one tragedy after
Mm-hmm.
another, which again
Mm-hmm.
is kind of the story of slavery, right? Just this
Mm-hmm.
never ending brutalization of people by white people. And
Yeah.
I think, again, like Octavia Butler, she's committed to telling this story. And so she committed to telling the whole story and wasn't
Mm-hmm.
worried about, protecting anyone's sensibilities. She's just like, this is what it was. And again, she wasn't making up these encounters, like the fact that,
Mm-hmm.
slaves were having their ears chopped off or being whipped to
Right.
within an inch of their life or being raped continuously by the slave owners. So, like I said, I think it's a difficult, painful story to tell, but it's one that needs to be told.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like it could have been, especially because there's the science fiction element, it could have come across as, I don't know, those two things when you think about like, I don't know, slavery and time travel, like you're not necessarily seeing that as a story that works. And I think
Sure.
it worked
Mm-hmm.
really well. And I don't read a lot of science fiction,
Mm-hmm.
and that never, I don't know, it never took me out of the story. I didn't also spend a lot of time thinking about like the mechanics of it because that
Yeah.
wasn't the point of the story
Mm-hmm.
either. And so I think she did a really good job of kind of seamlessly blending those two elements, the historical fiction and the science fiction
Yeah.
together.
Someone was telling me that it's deemed science fiction, like the story or the
Mm-hmm.
book. And I
Mm-hmm.
was like, that doesn't make sense to me because the science fiction part of it, it's never explained. It's just kind of
Mm-hmm.
this like thing that happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
it felt to me more like magical realism rather than science
Sure.
fiction.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and to your point too, like I also was not thinking too hard about
Yeah.
how she's doing this or why
Right.
she's doing this or why this is
Right.
happening to her. It was just happening, and that
Right.
sometimes stories are like that. But I think
Mm-hmm.
that was one criticism of folks who did not like this book was like, you never understand like why this is happening. I was like,
Mm,
yeah, it's not the point of the story. It's just a device to
yeah.
get her back and forth. And then dang, oh, there was something else about in the end, Octavia Butler does kind of talk about the lives of these people
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
Dana goes back to the plantation or where it
Mm-hmm.
was, and
Mm-hmm.
then they couldn't find grave sites or anything
Mm-hmm.
nearby. The history was a bit lost. So some people were like, why wasn't there any information about the people that were there? I was like, well, it possibly wasn't that
Yeah.
information wasn't available, right? But I mean, I guess she could have made something up, but that was one other criticism from people.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a really both a minor criticism and yeah, like I've said multiple times, a lot of maybe the history of the owners of the plantation of the white people on the plantation, there probably would have been more documentation. But yeah, for like the enslaved
Mm-hmm.
people, like and even free black people, like there probably wouldn't have been a ton
Yeah.
of documentation about
Mm-hmm.
who they were and where they went and what happened to them.
Yeah.
So I think that's perhaps speaking to a little bit of naivete on the part of the person who wrote that
Potentially.
particular review, perhaps. But yeah, was there anything else about the book that you wanted to touch on before we move into our final section?
I mean, talking about Rufus's mom,
Mm-hmm.
maybe thinking about, gosh, what was her name? Was it Margaret?
It's like Margaret, I think.
Lady, I don't
I think
remember.
it definitely
Yeah.
started with an M.
Okay. Well, I'm on to something here. Just thinking about like her story as well, because
Mm-hmm.
every person like kind of represented like a possible encounter from
Mm-hmm.
back in that day, right? And so the story of his mom is like she kind of was erratic and all over the place, like in the house, and like really got on people's cases about random things and couldn't leave things alone, and really didn't like Dana because her son Rufus really liked her. And then eventually at some point Dana leaves again for her own time, and the mom ends up having some children or miscarriages or something or
Mm-hmm.
stillbirths, and then just wasn't right after losing the
Mm-hmm.
children, and then
Mm-hmm.
went to her sisters in a different city, and then eventually does come back when the plantation owner dies.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, just to like add that into the mix, it was
Yeah.
an interesting part of the story.
Because I mean, I think the other thing, one of the other, I guess, narratives that was taking place during slavery is like the women of these
Mm-hmm.
slave owners, because yes, they had the privilege of being white, but they were also women. So in their own way, were
Mm-hmm.
considered, second class citizens who had very minimal rights. And so
Mm-hmm.
it does dive in a little bit. Let's call her Margaret. They do dive in a little bit into that part of slavery and that gosh, I really am just words are not coming to me tonight.
It is late. I'm
I
telling you.
know, I know. But yeah, really diving into a little bit at least what that
Mm-hmm.
experience was like being the white wife, woman of the
Mm-hmm.
house on a plantation and yeah, navigating this kind of weird in
Mm-hmm.
between space where yes, you have some privilege, but you're also facing your own form of oppression, but then you also have, especially for the enslaved people who worked in the house, usually the wife had the run of the house, right? And she was in
Mm-hmm.
charge of those enslaved individuals. And so you do have
Mm-hmm.
also this like modicum of power as well.
And you'll use it
And you'll
to
use it exactly.
right? Like if you're
Exactly.
feeling some way,
Mm-hmm.
that's the
Mm-hmm.
power that you can
Yes,
press
wield.
upon. Yeah.
Exactly. And if you want to lash out at someone or take out your own frustration, at not having your own voice be
Yeah.
heard, or yeah. So there's
Mm-hmm.
so many bizarre and unhealthy relationship dynamics happening
Oh,
at any
totally.
given moment,
Yeah.
especially if we're looking at a
Um,
plantation in particular during slavery.
yeah.
And that is something that she does, as you mentioned, she does dive into a little bit with her storyline.
And then also thinking about like as a woman, like I don't know, it just doesn't seem like it was monogamy for men wasn't really a thing
Oh God, no.
in his throughout history, right? And so
Yeah.
you just like watch your husband
Hmm.
rape these other women,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
then yeah, you're just kind of this
Yeah. And
you're
then have their like offspring, right?
yeah,
In the house or like out
right.
in the fields or whatever, knowing your husband has sired all of these other children who, depending on the man, may or may not treat them well too,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I
And so
think
just, yeah, yeah.
he ends up selling
Mm-hmm.
his children
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
the ones that he sired with
Yeah.
the enslaved women.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Just
All
so
of it's just
much. Just,
layered.
yeah, just
And
layered upon layer of misery and destruction and devastation and
yeah,
terror. And yeah. And I think when we talk about slavery, like those are the words we should be using instead of like, oh, well, it was a pleasant time. And
oh
this,
God.
enslaved folks were like well taken care. Like it's just like, oh my God, and
Uh,
even in the 90s when I was in school, like that was the story we were getting in our history
mm-hmm.
textbooks.
Trying to make it come back too,
Yeah,
apparently.
it's
God.
just yeah, exactly. Just wanting to like
Mm-hmm.
whitewash and sanitize it. So books like
Right.
this, I just want to, make sure that we're continuing to promote them and getting folks to read them and talk about them because it's hard,
Definitely.
it's difficult, but we can't run away from those things. And I really appreciate you reading this book.
Thank you. Thanks for having me read it. It definitely
Yeah.
was better than Horse. So I will
Good.
give it
Okay.
that.
And I figure since this book, Unlike Horse, was written by a Black woman,
Yes. Yes.
you
That's
would
part of
have
the reason.
have a better response to it. But okay, so then before we get to our literally the best, literally the worst, what would
Mhm.
be your final recommendation then for this book? Would you recommend this book, Kelsey?
Yes, I would recommend this book. I would also give a content warning to
Of
people.
course.
If you are not in a good like headspace or mental space for your own sake, probably not a good time to pick this up. If
Mhm.
you are curious about the history of slavery or even just getting a little bit of information on how it might have been for people, I think this is a really good option.
Mhm.
And I enjoyed the back and forth, even though you spend way less time in the present.
It's
You
true.
spend most of your time in the
It's
past.
true.
Uh,
Okay.
so yeah, I
Okay.
think it's
Yeah.
worth reading for sure.
Absolutely. And of course, I would obviously recommend it as I recommended it to Kelsey for the same reasons that Kelsey just listed. And,
Mm,
also just Octavia Butler is a very talented writer. And so if you haven't read any of her work, this is a great example of her skill as an author and
mhm.
could be a great place to start if you haven't read any of her works previously. So,
Ah,
yeah. All right. So, as always, I'll give a little blurb for
ah,
folks for whom this might be their first Lit It or Quit It episode. Kelsey is going to
that'd
read
be cool.
some 1-star reviews of this book from Goodreads. I'm going to read some 5-star reviews of this
Mhm.
book from Goodreads in a segment of our episode that we call Literally the Best or Literally the Worst.
Dun,
So,
dun.
Kelsey, would you like to begin or would you like me to begin?
I can go.
Okay.
So I have a mixture of longer and shorter ones. So
Okay.
FYI. All right. This first one is from Unplugged.
Okay.
DNF at 65%. Oh boy, where to start? Without giving away too many spoilers, I hate the main character who is basically completely fine with slavery and rape. The only person more clueless than her is possibly her white husband, who is a huge idiot when it comes to racial issues, despite marrying a black woman in the 1970s. Him being a dipshit in 1815, paraphrasing, they beat their slaves. I was planning on skipping over the rest to see if she gets better or starts to care about what she's seeing around her. But every time I skipped forward, she was more concerned about the health and well being of her rapist, slave owning great grandpa, than she was about anything else. Her being a dipshit to her great grandfather, paraphrasing, did you rape that girl? Well, let me get you cleaned up. That was an example of
Mhm.
quote. There are zeroable, likable things that are allowing me to continue reading this book. Also, the end is at the beginning, sort of like a prologue, so I already know how it ends, so whatever. Dropping this, going to pick up something with a more empathetic cast.
Wow. Oh my gosh, what a blistering review. I think the only thing I agree with is that yeah, like Kevin is kind of an idiot in some
Yeah.
ways. And I think that again, I think that's
Mm-hmm.
part of it. It's like he has a lot of ignorance as a white man, and there's a lot of things that he's clueless about. And yeah, he needs
Yeah,
to educate himself. And I think that's true. I think she's
totally.
being way too hard on Dana though. And I think there's a lot of both like 21st century privilege coming into that review.
Yeah.
And yeah, also just like a lack of empathy. And also keeping in mind, like, Rufus is both her great grandfather and also essentially keeping her alive. Like she is
Mm-hmm.
only surviving in this space largely because of him. So it's also
Mm-hmm.
like
There,
survival.
yeah, it's definitely comes down to survival, I think. And I think
Hmm.
too, when we go back to it in a book like this, an author is making very specific choices
Yeah.
to have a point come across.
Mm-hmm.
And so I
Mm-hmm.
think although Kevin really annoyed me as well, I think it was the point.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I
So
remember thinking, just as a quick aside, I remember thinking when I read the book, I'm like, ooh, are they going to make it? I don't know if Dana and like
I wondered the
Kevin are
same
going to
thing. I thought
last.
he was just gonna go and like be gone.
Yeah, I didn't. So we'll see. I could imagine them getting a divorce in the future or the end of this
After
book.
her experience, like totally.
Yeah. Just being like, wow,
Yes.
we are
And then
not this. Yeah.
reacclimating back to the 70s. Yeah, we need
Mm-hmm.
that epilogue.
Yes. Yes. Someone can do the fanfic. All
Fanfic.
right.
Yeah, please.
My first 5-star review, I do not know how to say this person's name or handle. It looks like Lena's, but here we go.
Yeah.
Kindred. Oh my fuck. Where do I even start? Definitely one of my favorite reads from this year, and definitely one of the most fucked up things I've ever read in my entire life. This book is not for the faint of heart. It is literally every Black person's literal nightmare. It will make you sick. It will make you think. It won't leave. Think. It won't leave you. It will stay with you. There's
Mm.
worse things than being dead. Written in 1979, Kindred remains Octavia E. Butler's most popular work until date. Kindred reveals the repressed trauma slavery caused in America's collective memory of history. In an interview in 1985, Butler suggested that this trauma partly comes from attempts to forget America's dark past. Quote, I think most people don't know or don't realize that at least 10 million Blacks were killed just on the way to this country, just during the Middle Passage. They don't really want to
Mhm.
hear it, partly because it makes whites feel guilty. End quote. So I shortened their review just because it was really
Okay.
long. But yeah, I completely agree with everything they said. And I really think it's important that people just like reckon with our country's very dark, bleak history.
Yeah. Okay. This one's really long. So
Okay.
FYI.
Okay.
I don't think I'm going to cut it. All right. And they're very, very critical. So
Oh boy,
here we
I'm bracing
go.
myself. I'm like holding onto the table. Here we go.
This is from Matt.
Okay,
Sorry.
Matt.
It troubles me and bothers me deeply that this book is so popular. This book reads like an apology for slavery. Others have called out that this book does a lot of telling and very little showing. For me, the biggest thing it shows is how easily the protagonist becomes conditioned to and accepting of slavery, an anti-ideal in the 1970s, a spineless, gritless woman who sucks up to being treated like a slave and being treated like a worthless woman. I am not surprised even Alice calls her what she calls her. She is addicted to her roofie, an abuser, a slaveholder, a manipulator, a man child, and keeps making excuses after sickening excuses for her addiction. Literally, many parts of this book reads like the story of an abusive victim who is reportedly told to leave their partner but stubbornly still clings. And what was the outcome of clinging to abuse? Predictably bad. Okay, I am going to cut this.
Okay.
This book was so seriously wrong, disturbingly gaslit. It just doesn't get any better, this guy. I just wanted to
For
include
all
it
of the
because
people, so here's my thing. For all of the people who are like, oh my gosh, like she acclimated too quickly and she was too
yeah.
forgiving. I'm like, what was the alternative? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what could she do in that situation? If she ran away, she would have gotten caught and either beaten or killed.
She
Like
was
that's the whole
when she did
point. It's
try.
like there was no
Mm-hmm.
out. If there was, do you think all of these millions of people would have stayed in slavery for as long? Like there wasn't an
Mm-hmm.
easy out. So many people died trying, and some
Yep.
people did ultimately obviously escape to the north, but like it wasn't like they could
Mm-hmm.
just up and leave anytime they wanted, which
Mm-hmm.
is the whole point of the story. And the fact that
Yeah.
so many people like, oh my gosh, why didn't she just leave, or why was she just like she was trying to survive, as
Yeah.
like so many, sorry, I'm like getting worked up, like as so many people right in that
um,
situation were, and it just comes
yeah.
across as so, I don't know, close-minded and shallow and ignorant to be like, well, why didn't
Yeah.
that just
And so I don't agree with the way that he talks about abusive relationships and
yeah.
clearly has no like context of like what it actually means to be an abusive relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And although like slavery in general, yeah, it
Was
was
a
all
massively abusive
abusive.
relationship.
People died because of the way they were
Yeah.
treated, right? Like
Yeah.
it wasn't a choice that people were
No.
making.
Exactly.
That's the problem in
Exactly. And
this
it wasn't a
review.
relationship either. Like that's not even the right word.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not. She was like being called back to Rufus, right?
Right.
And while I do think her nickname for him is kind of
Mm-hmm.
weird and she
Mm-hmm.
kind of infantilizes him as he
Mm-hmm.
grows up, I don't like that part of the book,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, like you're saying, like there was not a choice. Slavery isn't a
Yeah.
choice
Right. And we see her trying. Like she
people are making.
literally slits her own wrists to leave.
Yeah.
Right. Like what more do you want this woman to do? Like she's trying to send letters to her husband when he's trapped back in that time. Like she is trying. So it just seems overly simplistic to have that response. Okay. Next up, Kevin Kuhn, I think, Kuhn.
Okay.
Okay. I highly recommend reading this book anytime, but especially during Black History Month, as it is this month. I will also warn that it is an emotionally devastating story. Kindred follows Dana Franklin, a modern day 26-year-old female Black writer, through a series of time travel episodes that pull her into a pre-Civil War plantation located in Maryland. While the novel is horrifying, dealing with whippings, suicide, rape, and slavery sales that separate families, I read that Butler decided to lessen the violence and brutality that she read in historical accounts to allow the story to be more approachable. A shuddering revelation. What intrigued me right
Sure.
away is that Butler could have written a straight up powerful critique of American history and the continuing issues of racism and bigotry. But she chose to dive deeper by having Dana be married to a white husband in her modern life. In addition, Dana is intricately connected to an ancestor, Rufus, the white son of a plantation slave owner. Rufus has a dysfunctional attraction to a Black woman who was born free but enslaved for attempting to help her slave husband to escape north. Dana knows that Alice must give birth to a daughter by Rufus to allow Dana to exist in the future. But it's these complex interracial relationships that allow Butler to investigate all types of subtleties of theme. The resulting exploration of power dynamics, guilt, and trauma make the book a much more effective examination of sexism, bigotry, and racism and its wake, and allows it to be a powerful lesson for today's issues. A well-told, emotionally difficult, but necessary read. Butler's tale is science fiction at its best, using the improbable to expose and magnify humanity's past atrocities and reveal why learning from the past is even more important today. 5 stars. Thank you so much, Kevin, for so beautifully and so concisely saying why this is needed and so perfect. Yeah, I agree with everything he said. There was something in there that we hadn't. Oh, yeah. The fact that people are like, oh my gosh, this book is so horrifying. And this is just like the tip of the iceberg.
Oh,
Like,
yeah, I bet.
there's even stuff
No
in
doubts
the
about it.
Underground Railroad that I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this actually happened to another human being. And like, yeah, this wasn't out of the ordinary. And the fact that she had to
Yeah.
scale it back so people could feel like it was believable and could like feel like this is a book that they could engage with is just like, yeah, a whole other thing. But
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Let's do one more each because I think we've both.
That sounds good.
there's
Yeah.
some long ones. Yeah.
Okay. This one, again from Goodreads, is from Ruby Truesdale. Nothing about this book was enjoyable. I was just rage reading to see if Rufus would die. There was no lovable characters. Dana and Kevin's relationship was bland and unconvincing, so there was not really any stakes for the reader to want her to return to her own time. Also, the ending sucked. This book followed my personal pet peeve, which is when authors use sci-fi fantasy concepts without any attempt at an explanation or wider magic system. It was just a convenient plot device. I've taken away nothing from this book other than the strong desire to never read another book about slavery.
Oh my. This honestly, this sounds like it was written by somebody who usually reads like fantasy or romantasy and it was just like not ready for what they were about to like.
I think that's
dive
very
into.
possible.
Yes.
The only thing I agreed with was, Dana and Kevin's relationship. Yeah. It's
being
like,
bland. Yeah.
I did want her to go back to her time, but only
same.
so the things that were happening in the in the past would stop happening.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah,
knew
exactly.
that it was always only for like a couple pages or so. So
I also that just reminded me of the thing from the review I just read, is that what folks also are not thinking about when they're writing their reviews, the one star, is that Dana has to make sure that her ancestor is born. So that is part of like her thinking. We didn't really talk
like she
about it.
can't, like,
she
change
has,
things.
and she has to make sure like Alice, unfortunately, and Rufus get together, and it's one of the reasons why she kind of helps that happen. And I feel like folks have kind of just set that aside in some of the reviews. Like that's also another factor and why she's behaving.
Yeah, or it's just also like you can't change the past, right?
Right.
Like because Dana literally wouldn't be where she's at. She wouldn't be alive. This wouldn't be happening if she didn't end up being born. And the only way she was being born, it was all these things would happen.
Yeah.
So it's like a what came first, right? Like yeah. So
yeah. Well, it's like, the conundrum that always comes up with time travel. But yeah. Okay. Last one for me is from Justin Tate. This is a short one.
Okay.
A unique look at slave era America thanks to a time traveling twist. Should be shelved with the classics, riveting from the first page and doesn't let up. I'm always a fan of throwing in a little sci-fi, but here it really, really works. Most novels on this subject tend to look at race relations from one time period. Nothing wrong with that, but there was something wholly shocking and eye-opening about having these characters hop from a modern 1970s lens to pre-Civil War society. This is my first Octavia E. Butler novel, but I'm already a huge fan. Which of her books should I read next?
That is a good question.
Parable of the Sower, I would say. But yeah. Okay, I know this was a late episode recording for us, and we are both at the end of a long day. Kelsey more so than I.
Take a shower and go to bed.
Yes. So really quickly before we do all that, just a reminder, you can find us on Instagram at @litvibesonly_podcast. You can find us on YouTube or TikTok at @litvibesonlypodcast. We dove into a lot of heavy things today and had some strong opinions, or at least I did. So if you would like to respond to those, if you have your own thoughts to share, please do so. Either comment on our Spotify episode or head over to our socials and let us know. Have a chat with us. I'd love to dive into this,
and rate and review.
Yes. Oh, you're so good.
Don't forget that.
Yes, rate and review us, and then come back next week for more. So on that note, we will see you next Monday.
See you next Monday. Bye.